The last session for tonight on the future of content, in a sense, encompasses all we have discussed so far. Inevitably, it questions the traditional role of museums and curators as sole experts, but most importantly, it questions their power, their purpose, and the means to achieve it. So having said that, our first speaker doesn't like to be called an expert, but I believe she is. Please welcome Zandra Yeaman, Curator of Discomfort at the Hunterian in the University of Glasgow, who will present exactly what her work is, Curating Discomfort. Zandra.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you for inviting me along to speak today. And I had to think, well, where do I start? Because I've only been in this post for just over a year, and it's been quite a dynamic year, quite an interesting year. And my colleagues at the Hunterian, it's been quite an interesting experience, us working together, collaborating, creating discomfort. So I thought I would start with a wee bit about myself. So, I'm a Glaswegian, but my own heritage is based around India, Ireland and Scotland and England, Wales and Northwestern Europe. So as you can quite clearly see, a product of empire. So it is that argument of I am here because you were there. And when we look at museums and how they are currently constructed in Scotland, many of the objects and belongings on display and in the stores do come from or are linked to empire, colonialism, slavery and migration. So it's not a surprise that a lot of my work around curating this is exploring these stories that we don't tell and layering the stories to bring some of the narratives about, including my own heritage, into the stories. And to take you back in my post at the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights that got me drawn into looking at history and linking it in particular with a lot of the anti-racism and human rights activism that I've been involved in over the last 20 years. So this is an archive of a lot of the front covers that you will find on that website, Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights website, where we were coordinating events around Black History Month for the last 20 years. And what we did was we tried to put forward that Black history was Scotland's history. So if you get the chance, please do look into those archive programmes, because a lot of the conversations that we're having through Curating Discomfort, a lot of the global conversations that are happening right now, a lot of it you will see within our archives, and the fact that, as activists and as strategic anti-racist organisation, we were pushing this agenda forward for such a long time, to the point that in 2007, CRER had actually engaged Dr. Stephen Millen to do some research in our built heritage in Glasgow. And what we found through our research was Scotland's links to the transatlantic slave trade. And Scotland managed to actually distance itself from that history. And we couldn't understand why, because none of us in Scotland actually learn any of this at school. We don't see it represented in museums. And then further down the line, if we use the University College slave database, we started to dig deep and actually find out, well, who received compensation with regards of owning enslaved African people. So as you can see here, how did we manage to distance ourselves from this history when we clearly were complicit in this vile trade? So by 1833, when we think back to abolition, the Scottish population was actually less than 10% of the UK population as a whole. But most importantly, no enslaved African received reparations or compensation. And you'll see in this slide that there's two different colours between the numbers. So the colours that are in purple is what it was in 1833, and the colours in red was transforming that into what that would mean in present day finances. And I wanted to share this because this basically is a lot of the foundation of Curating Discomfort. The other thing that we explore is the representation in our environment. So here we have friezes and statues all around the city of Glasgow, but all over Scotland. And I'm sure many of you will be looking at the global conversations around statues. And we have to kind of think critically about, well, this is the kind of representation that many of us who have ancestors that are linked to empire, colonialism, slavery, migration, this is how our ancestors are being represented. So to take you into creating discomfort and what a big part of the work has been. So while many museums do a lot of community engagement work, sometimes we forget about the internal structures and practices of our institutions. So for the first part of my work has actually been looking internally, working with museum professionals, answering questions. And also I've developed a workshop that helps us to explore much of the uncomfortable conversations that we have to have if we want to make our museum spaces much more inclusive and more welcoming. And I have to say that sometimes with some of the concepts that I'm going to cover today, sometimes referring to others as white, may feel like we are reinforcing the problematic categories of race that we are trying to deconstruct. But at the same time, we want to signal that we recognise that even as racial categories are a problematic social construct, racism, as well as the benefits for white-skinned people that they experience, are very real. So some of the concepts that I encourage people to talk about and explore, I feel helps us to impact some of the systematic inequities. So the reason I focus on anti-racism is we have had over 50 years of race equality legislation in the UK, and yet we still see Black minority ethnic people being disproportionately represented across all areas of society. A big part of my work has a focus in museums and how we are represented and how our ancestry, how our stories are being represented through the objects and belongings that are on display. So one of the ways I started was to think about, well, what are the questions that people always ask? So it's things like, what is race? Why does racism exist in Scotland? I'm not racist, so why should anti-racism matter to me? So I don't have time to go through all those questions today. So if you Google Curating Discomfort, the Hunterian staff blog, you'll be able to see a bit more in detail through a blog that actually explores these questions. But what we do is we do look at key concepts. So thinking about identifying and dismantling white supremacy. So we're thinking about white supremacy, which sometimes people feel very uncomfortable to talk about because they think about white supremacists, and that's the visual they have. But what we do is we explore, well, what is white supremacy? A political, economic and cultural system in which white Western ideals control the power of the text, the material, the resources and ideas of cultural superiority. We also look at white privilege, how white people, communities and culture are centred in our society and valued above others, leading to white people having unequal and unfair access to opportunities and resources compared to Black minority ethnic people or visible ethnic minority people in Scotland today. And we explore white fragility because that fragility is what causes a lot of barriers for us to continue with the work that we want to do going forward, because people do not like the idea of being accused or feeling guilty, so therefore they become defensive and denial and resistance takes place. But when we actually have the time to explore what these concepts mean and how we relate them to the past and how they show up in present, I found that it's interesting actually curating people through that discomfort and the change that happens when we're actually exploring or researching or thinking about objects and belongings and how we display them. It's really helpful. So to give you an idea of some of the outcomes of these workshops is, and I know that this is quite a big graphic and maybe you'll be able to have a look at it later, but this is part of what the work we do internally. So we explore white supremacy, white fragility, white privilege, and then we think about, well, where does that show up in the functions and practices within our museum? whether it's in recruitment in HR, whether it's our programming, our workforce, the people who donate to our organisation, our board of governance, it could be curation. There's so many functions and practices, as I'm sure you know, within an institution like a museum. So in this slide, there's just some of the functions and practices that we explored. So we think about those concepts and we think, well, where do they show up right now? But the most important part, and this is where the action planning for us to go forward, to think about the stories and the narratives and the collections and how we represent them. What concrete steps can we take to change how we are currently dealing with the functions and practices in the way that we do? So as you can see here, the concrete steps to change, and what that helps to do is help us to understand our interplay with the structures, our complicity in the structures, and actually us taking ownership and responsibility for creating those changes. Now, I believe very strongly that we have to have this background information and understanding before we actually do community engagement, because often in museums, when we do community engagement, there still is a power imbalance. There is that idea that the knowledge and experience of people coming from outside museums does not match the knowledge and experience of the people inside museums, when actually what we are doing is creating equity of our knowledge and experience and sharing our knowledge and experience together so that we can actually build for better spaces and more welcoming and inclusive spaces within our museums. And to go forward thinking about creating discomfort. So where are we now? So currently, and this isn't everyone representing this photo, we have a team of museum professionals from the Hunterian that cover team members from every area of the Hunterian. So that could be audience engagement, it could be design, the tech, it could be curators, and so forth. And then we have 6 community curators who are cross-generational, multi-ethnic. There's lots of intersections in there. And what we've found is it's been great to be able to explore our own identities and experiences in this. So, for instance, I have the direct lived experience of growing up in Glasgow, mixed heritage, and dealing with structures from the moment I was born to present. Some people have migrated to Scotland 30 years ago. Some people have migrated to Scotland more recently. And what else is interesting is it also allows us to look at that notion of what we mean by community. So the community creators are made of post fellows, master's students, activists, retired educators. So it's quite a broad spectrum. And what I mean by that is, for me, when we're working in museums with community groups, it should be representative of the city and the place that we are situated. And I feel that we've managed to do that with Curating Discomfort. But what we did before we actually brought the full team together, we had a community conversation. And we believe there's power in this place, and we want to also begin unfinished conversations. So what we did was we had a conversation amongst ourselves where our colleagues from the Hunterian had to listen. So we wanted them to have that experience of how museums can be very voyeuristic to people like us. And they through this conversation, it enabled them to have that emotive feeling of how voyeuristic. It also enabled us to have conversations about the things that we want to talk about and the way that we want things to be represented in museums, especially objects and belongings that relate to our culture, our heritage and our ancestry. And to give you some more examples of what Curating Discomfort hopes to achieve, particularly when we're looking at storytelling, this was a social media piece that I had put together commemorating the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade. And what was very important about this, I used a piece of amber to be able to tell a story about people, to be able to fix the gaze not from white colonisation, but to African people who were self-emancipating. And I think that's really what we're looking at around creating discomfort and storytelling and what we want to do going forward, particularly in Scotland, working in museums. And I'll give you another example of two labels and the difference to try and show the shift. So this is a label in a museum in Scotland, and I won't name it. And it talks about a particular, what they call a token. And what I thought was very interesting about this, and something that we have to really understand, is museums hold authority that is not often challenged. They do educate people. People walk into these spaces, see objects and belongings being displayed, and they believe what they see in the label, and they think it to be true. So this label talks about a particular token. It creates a narrative around that token, talks about who would have maybe used it, talks about the material culture. And when I first saw this, it didn't feel right, so I started to do my own research. So here's my label based on my research. The token's called a Barbados pineapple penny. The pineapple symbolises imperial trade and tropical luxuries facilitated through chattel slavery. The token penny was not official currency and could only be used in Barbados. So that previous label talked about Glasgow merchants would have used these tokens. It's not true. It was commissioned in 1788 by the Barbados plantation owner Sir Philip Gibbs, now part of the Hunterian Museum collection. The depiction of the African serving the crown as obedient, civilised and improved responds directly to images of an enslaved man in manacles used by anti-slavery campaigners. And Barbadian enslavers whose wealth depended on their ownership of fellow humans opposed the abolition of chattel slavery. So what I've tried to do here is introduce some of the language, because there's no museum in Scotland that talks about chattel slavery. They talk about slavery, and that conflates. What do we actually mean by that? They talk about merchants. They don't talk about enslavers or plantation owners, and they never centre the Black presence in any of these stories. So I'm giving you a whistle-stop tour of Curating Discomfort. All I can do is ask you if there's further information that you would like to receive. My email and my contact details are there. Please feel free to get in touch. We have till April 22 to finish this piece of work, and what we're doing ongoing is collaborating with our team and actually having output, because museums love output. So we will be finished in April with an exhibition, but the work's not finished. As I said, this is the beginning of an unfinished conversation. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Zandra. This was very fascinating, a lot of new ideas. Could I ask you, do you work with communities and with these conversations only regarding objects that are already existed in the collection, so with contested histories, or do you actually create new content, new stories from living cultures?
Well, what we've been doing is working with a broad spectrum of people, because one of the things that I think is really important about this history is it's threaded through. So I'm of South Asian descent, but I'm also of Irish descent, and I can see a big part of our history is connected to that. So even if we want to explore anti-Blackness as an issue, well, South Asian, Irish, it's all there. It allows us to think about, well, what is it like being colonised, but then becoming the coloniser? So in answer to your question, and I hope I'm answering it correctly, is what we're doing is we're layering the narrative, layering the stories, and making sure that the centre of the narrative isn't what has often been. So in particular, if you look at a university museum like the Hunterian, then the narrative is very, very focused on the white alumni from that university. How did these people get these collections? Well, many of them actually migrated around the empire, and that's where they gathered. But there's nothing in the narratives or the labels that tells you about that. There's no word like migrant or immigrant in museum. That they don't talk about it in that way.
Yeah.
So it's about trying to stop that othering.
Yes, exactly. And we have to change the language even and use both positive and sometimes negative words. Another question about your audience. This process of co-creation you've been using for exhibition and programs, has it led to an increase of attendance and or a diversification of your audience?
Well, you'll need to invite me back next year to find out, because what is actually exciting about this work is it is very experimental. We are being afforded the space to do this. The output that museums so love, which will be an exhibition, will be on display in April next year. So that's when we'll be able to think about, well, are we engaging diverse audiences? Are we engaging more people through this work? We can't actually measure that at this moment, except with the engagement that we are having through the interest of Curating Discomfort, I suppose. But it goes beyond Curating Discomfort. This is about the whole of the institution and creating change and putting audience and community at the centre of our work. So it's not only Curating Discomfort that's doing this, it's the whole institution.
Thank you. So another question to keep for next year is whether you have experienced any resistance from your audience. This is the other side of the coin.
Yes, well, there's two things that happen, actually. So there's people who will challenge some of the history, and I find that quite exciting, because what that means is they've not been informed. So everything that we do is backed up with evidence. It's not just a statement, it's like it's research. It's thoroughly researched. So for me, museums are great spaces where we can actually present the evidence, and then it's up to individuals whether they want to take that evidence on board or not. But as long as we can back what we're saying up with evidence, I don't think there's a problem. So there is some people who do push back, but mostly we've been receiving a lot of positivity. A lot of people in Scotland want to see this happen here. They want it to change. There's a lot of work happening in museums across Scotland at the moment. So I can only see that as a positive thing. Being titled Curator of Discomfort also enables me to curate that discomfort, so there doesn't seem to be a lot of opposition there. And I should also say, as a human rights campaigner, I'm used to opposition, so it's quite surprising the lack of opposition that I'm facing at the moment. I'm not used to that.
True, yeah, but still, you have to at one point invite those that are more difficult, the more difficult audiences. So those that will oppose you, and there is the challenge actually for all museums, to be able to invite.
I think it's part of the work. I mean, we do engage. We do, as I was saying, there's people who contact us, and we do respond and we do engage. It won't be until we have something visible in front of them that should make and you're right, that's where we'll know the impact. But I should also add, Sophia, museums need to be brave, and they do have to understand that they can't say on the one hand that they want to change the story and the narrative and tell the history in its true sense, and diversify its audiences without accepting and acknowledging they will lose some people. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, but they would gain a lot more and a lot more interesting ideas as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll have to stop here. Wish we had the time to discuss these things. Hopefully in the future we will. And have a good night.
Thank you.